There is a specific texture to invisibility. It feels rough against the skin, like wool that has been washed too many times, and it smells faintly of cedar and old lavender. That was what I was wearing, after all. My charcoal gray suit, purchased 30 years ago for my 25th anniversary, was the armor I had chosen for the day my only son was to be married. To me, it smelled of the sachets my late wife, Martha, used to tuck into the corners of our wardrobe to keep the moths away. To everyone else in the opulent, marble-floored foyer of the Grandview estate, it smelled like something that belonged in a donation bin. I stood near a towering arrangement of white hydrangeas, watching the guests flow past me like a river of silk and money. They were beautiful, these people. The women wore gowns that shimmered under the crystal chandeliers, fabrics that looked like liquid gold and crushed diamonds. The men were encased in bespoke Italian wool, their watches costing more than the first house I ever bought. They moved with the easy, careless grace of people who have never had to check a price tag in their lives. And as they passed me, they performed a social miracle I had seen many times before, but never felt so acutely. They didn't see me. Their eyes would slide over my thinning hair, my scuffed shoes, and the fraying cuffs of my jacket, and then simply glaze over. They gave me a wide berth, parting around me not out of respect, but out of a subtle, instinctive fear of contagion. They looked at me and saw a stain on the pristine tablecloth of their evening. They saw the help, or perhaps a confused elderly relative who had wandered away from a nursing home. But I was neither. I was Thomas. I was the father of the groom. I touched the lapel of my jacket, my thumb tracing the worn fabric. "Wear the gray one, Thomas," Martha had said that night, 3 decades ago. I missed her with a physical ache that sat heavy in the center of my chest, a cold stone that never warmed up. If she were here, she would be marching up to these people, introducing herself, demanding they see us. But Martha was gone, buried under a modest headstone 3 years ago, and I was alone in a room full of 300 people. I reached into my pocket and touched the invitation. It was heavy cardstock, embossed with gold leaf, thick and creamy. Julian had sent it to me 3 weeks ago, not hand-delivered, mailed, and stuck to the front, right over the calligraphy, was a yellow sticky note in his sharp, angular handwriting. "Dad, please try to blend in. No speeches." That was it, just a command to disappear. I wasn't invited to the rehearsal dinner last night. I wasn't asked to stand by his side as his best man, or even just as his father. I was an obligation, a box to be ticked so that the family photos wouldn't have a conspicuous gap. The heavy oak doors to the main hall opened, and the usher, a young man who looked at me with open pity, gestured for us to enter. I followed the crowd, keeping my head down. I checked the seating chart, though I already knew what I would find. The bride's family was in the front row. Senators, CEOs, people of influence. My name was typed on a small card at table 40, but for the ceremony, I was directed to the back row, behind a massive stone pillar that smelled of moss and money. I sat down on the folding chair, my knees popping audibly in the hush. A woman in front of me turned, glared at the sound, and then turned back, adjusting her fur stole. I leaned to the side, trying to peer around the pillar as the music started. It wasn't the traditional organ music Martha had loved. It was a string quartet playing a pop song I vaguely recognized, something about ruling the world. Then I saw him. Julian stood at the altar. He looked handsome, I had to give him that. He was wearing a tuxedo that fit him like a second skin, his hair styled perfectly, his posture radiating a terrifying kind of confidence. He checked his reflection in the brass railing of the altar, adjusting his cuffs. He looked successful. He looked powerful. He looked utterly unrecognizable to me. My mind flashed back to a Saturday morning 30 years ago. We were by the lake, the air smelling of pine needles and mud. Julian was 7. He had caught a small sunfish, and when he realized the hook had hurt it, he had burst into tears. He made me release it, his small hands trembling in mine as we lowered the fish back into the water. "I don't want to hurt anything, Dad," he had sobbed into my flannel shirt. Where was that boy? The man at the altar didn't look like he would cry over a fish. He looked like he would eat it alive and complain about the texture. Vanessa walked down the aisle. She was beautiful in a sharp, angular way, like a diamond that could cut glass. Her laughter, when I had met her briefly 6 months ago, sounded like breaking china. She measured human worth by the carat, and I had come up short. As she reached Julian, he didn't look at her with love. He looked at her with possession. They exchanged vows that didn't mention sickness or health or for poorer. I felt a profound, hollow ache in my chest. It wasn't anger yet. It was the crushing, suffocating weight of failure. I had failed him. I had taught him to fish. I had taught him to read. I had taught him to tie his shoes. But somewhere along the line, I had failed to teach him what actually mattered. I had raised a son who thought a wedding was a merger and a father was a liability. The ceremony ended with a release of white doves. One of them seemed confused, flapping frantically against a window before finding the open sky. I felt a kinship with that bird. The crowd moved to the terrace for the cocktail hour. I drifted with them, a piece of driftwood in a luxury current. I found a spot near a massive ice sculpture of a swan, clutching a glass of tap water because the champagne felt like a lie I couldn't swallow. I watched groups of people laughing, clinking glasses, talking about stocks and summer homes. I stood there, surrounded by 300 people, and I had never felt more like a ghost. I wondered if it was better to be alone than to be with people who are ashamed of you. If you've ever felt the cold sting of rejection from your own flesh and blood, if you've ever been made to feel small by the people you raised to be big, hit that subscribe button. Because what my son didn't know was that while he was ashamed of my past, he should have been terrified of my present. The dinner chimes rang. The sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the manicured lawn. The reception line was forming near the entrance to the grand ballroom. I hesitated. The note had said blend in, but he was my son. This was his wedding day. I couldn't just sit in the back and eat my chicken in silence without looking him in the eye at least once. I reached into my pocket, and my fingers closed around the smooth, warm wood of the gift I had brought. It wasn't a check. It wasn't a silver platter. It was a compass. My grandfather had carved it during the war. It was simple, battered, and the needle always pointed true north, no matter how much you shook it. It was the most valuable thing I owned, not in dollars, but in soul. I wanted Julian to have it. I wanted him to find his way back. I joined the line. I saw Vanessa's parents ahead of me, greeting the couple. There were hugs, kisses, flashes of jewelry. Then the line moved, and I was next. Julian turned, a practiced smile plastered on his face. When he saw me, the smile didn't just fade, it vanished, like a candle snuffed out by a sudden draft. His eyes darted left and right, scanning the immediate area to see who was watching. "Dad," he said. It wasn't a greeting. It was an accusation. "Hello, Julian," I said, stepping forward. "You look—" I reached out a hand to touch his shoulder, a fatherly gesture. He flinched. He actually flinched. Before I could pull the compass from my pocket, he stepped out of the receiving line, grabbed my elbow with a grip that was bruising in its intensity, and steered me forcefully away from the guests. He marched me toward a shadowed alcove near the kitchen service doors, where the waiters were stacking trays of dirty glasses. He cornered me there, his body blocking me from the view of the ballroom. His face was flushed, his eyes hard and shiny like marbles. "Dad," he hissed, his voice a low, venomous whisper. "I just wanted to congratulate you," I said, rubbing my arm where he had grabbed me. He looked at my suit. His gaze raked over the thinning fabric at the elbows, the slight fray of the collar. his lip curled in unmasked disgust. He reached out and aggressively brushed an invisible speck of dust off his own pristine lapel, as if my proximity had soiled him. "I told you to buy a new suit, Dad," he spat. "I sent it back," I said quietly. "This was your mother's favorite. Mother is dead," he cut me off, the words brutal and flat. "She's dead, Dad, and you look like a beggar. Do you have any idea who is in that room? My investors, the board of directors. Vanessa's father is the CEO of Apex Global." I felt the blood drain from my face. "You're an embarrassment," he whispered, leaning in closer. He checked over his shoulder again to ensure his wealthy new in-laws weren't witnessing this. Then he turned back to me, and he did something that fractured my heart permanently. He sniffed the air around me. He wrinkled his nose, a look of pure visceral revulsion. "God," he groaned, "you even smell like it. You smell like mothballs and failure. You smell like poverty, Dad." The words hung in the air between us, vibrating with cruelty. "You smell like poverty." He wasn't done. He pointed a manicured finger at my chest. "Do me a favor. Do not talk to the investors. Do not talk to Vanessa's father. Just go find your table in the back. Eat your meal quickly and leave before the speeches start." He stepped back, adjusting his tie, smoothing out the front of his jacket. "Just try not to exist for the next 2 hours." He turned on his heel and walked back toward the light, toward the laughter, toward the woman who broke glass when she laughed, leaving me standing in the smell of stale dishwater and my own shattered heart. I stood there for a long time. I looked down at the hand-carved compass in my hand. It was vibrating slightly from the tremor in my fingers. True north. Julian thought I was a retired warehouse manager. He thought I lived on a meager pension and memories of a dead wife. He thought I smelled like poverty because I chose to live in the small house he grew up in, because I drove a 10-year-old truck, because I wore a 30-year-old suit. He didn't know. He didn't know about the mining logistics firm I had started with a single truck 40 years ago. He didn't know about the lithium contracts I had secured in Nevada before anyone knew what an EV battery was. He didn't know that 5 years ago I had sold that company to a conglomerate for 9 figures. I had kept it a secret. I had kept it quiet because I wanted to know if my son loved me for me or for my wallet. I wanted to see if the boy who cried over a fish was still in there, or if he had been fully consumed by the man who worshipped gold. I looked at the compass again. The needle held steady. I realized with a clarity that was both cold and liberating that the test was over. He failed. I didn't feel sad anymore. The grief was gone, replaced by something much harder, something made of steel and cold calculation. He thought I smelled like poverty. Fine. I pocketed the compass. I reached up and straightened my worn tie, smoothing the silk that Marfa had picked out. I wasn't going to go to the back. I wasn't going to eat his chicken. I wasn't going to disappear. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a phone. Not the cracked Android I used when I visited Julian, but the other one, the satellite phone. I dialed a number. "Prepare the transport," I said into the receiver, my voice steady and deep. "I'm leaving." I walked out of the alcove, past the reception line, and headed for the double doors that led to the great lawn. I wasn't just leaving a wedding, I was leaving a life. And I was about to show my son exactly what kind of poverty he had just bought himself. The air outside the banquet hall tasted different. It didn't smell of expensive perfume, desperate ambition, or the metallic tang of social climbing. It smelled of cut grass, impending storms, and the crisp, clean scent of a decision finally made. I walked past the round tables laden with half-eaten lobster tails and untouched truffles, ignoring the stares of the few guests who had wandered out to the terrace for a smoke. They looked at me with that same pitiful dismissal they had worn all evening, but it didn't sting anymore. It felt distant, like a memory of a pain I used to have. I didn't look back at the heavy oak doors where my son was currently charming his way through a cocktail hour funded by his father-in-law's ego. I just kept walking. I stepped off the stone patio and walked straight out onto the manicured great lawn of the Grandview estate. The sun had dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent streaks of bruised purple and burning orange. The twilight was settling in, cool and biting, nipping at the exposed skin of my neck. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs, purging the scent of hypocrisy that had been choking me for the last hour. I felt lighter. The heavy cloak of fatherly guilt, the one I had worn for 30 years, wondering if I was doing enough, earning enough, being enough, had finally slipped off my shoulders. I reached into the inner pocket of my worn gray suit, the pocket right over my heart, and bypassed the cracked Android I used when I visited Julian. My fingers closed around the cold, smooth metal of the other phone, the one I never took out in public. It was a sleek, satellite-encrypted device, heavy and black, with no brand markings. I pulled it out and dialed a single number programmed into the speed dial. "Captain," I said, my voice low and steady, "I'm in position, center of the south lawn." "Copy that, Mr. Chairman," the voice crackled back, professional and sharp, devoid of the condescension I had listened to all day. "We have visual. ETA 2 minutes." I slid the phone back into my pocket and stood there, a solitary figure in a 30-year-old suit, planting my feet on the grass. Inside the glass-walled conservatory behind me, 50 yards away, the lights had dimmed for the speeches. I could see the silhouettes of the guests finding their seats. I saw Julian standing near the head table, holding a microphone. He was laughing, his head thrown back, his hand resting casually in his pocket. He looked like a prince in his castle, regaling his court with tales of his conquests. He had no idea the castle was made of sand and the tide was coming in. This venue, the Grandview Estate, was the premier wedding location in the state. It cost $50,000 just to unlock the doors. Julian had bragged to me for months about securing it, about how he had to pull strings with the ownership group, how he had impressed the board with his corporate synergy to get a discount. He thought the ownership group was a faceless conglomerate called Veritas Holdings. He didn't know Latin. He didn't know that Veritas means truth. He didn't know that Veritas Holdings was my family office. He didn't know that I had bought this estate 3 years ago as a diversification asset because I liked the view of the valley. He didn't know that he was standing on my grass, drinking my wine, under a roof that I owned, while he mocked the very man who signed the deed. Then the sound began. It started as a low thrumming in the distance, a rhythmic vibration that you felt in your chest before you heard it with your ears. Thwup, thwup, thwup. It was a deep, resonant percussion that disturbed the evening air. It grew louder, a mechanical heartbeat accelerating rapidly. The leaves on the decorative oak trees lining the drive began to tremble. Inside the hall, I saw heads turning. Through the glass, I saw the guests looking around, confused. The chandeliers began to tinkle, a soft, crystalline warning that grew into a rattle. The water in the crystal glasses on the tables rippled like something out of a dinosaur movie. Julian stopped talking. He looked at the microphone as if it were malfunctioning, tapping it with his finger. The sound escalated to a roar. The wind picked up, whipping my thinning hair back, flapping the vents of my old suit jacket violently against my legs. I didn't move. I stood like a statue, my hands clasped behind my back, my eyes fixed on the tree line. Then it crested the trees. It was a shark in the sky, an Airbus H-160, sleek, black, and lethal-looking. It was a machine of pure aerodynamic perfection, the kind of helicopter reserved for heads of state and billionaires who needed to be in Zurich for breakfast and Tokyo for dinner. The navigation lights cut through the twilight, red, green, and a blinding white spotlight that swept the lawn before locking onto me. The downwash hit the venue with the force of a hurricane. The heavy glass doors of the conservatory rattled in their frames. The carefully arranged flower arches on the patio were blown over, scattering white petals across the stone like snow. Inside, panic ensued. I saw guests rushing to the windows, their faces pressed against the glass, mouths open in shock. The toast was ruined. The attention had shifted from the groom to the apocalypse descending on the lawn. The helicopter descended, the roar deafening now. It hovered for a moment, kicking up a storm of grass and dust, flattening the manicured lawn into submission. Then the landing gear touched down with a heavy, authoritative thud. The engine whined as the rotor slowed slightly, but kept spinning, ready to leap back into the sky at a moment's notice. The side door slid open. A pilot in a crisp, dark uniform jumped out. He didn't run to chase me away. He didn't run to tell me I was trespassing. He ran toward me, bowing his head against the wind, clutching a tablet against his chest. He stopped in front of me and snapped a salute that was sharp enough to cut paper. "Mister," the pilot shouted over the roar of the rotors, "we have the flight plan to Zurich filed. The board is waiting for your signature on the merger." I nodded, calm in the eye of the storm. Then the double doors of the banquet hall burst open. Julian came running out, his face twisted in fury, followed closely by Vanessa and her father, the CEO of Apex Global. Julian was screaming, his mouth moving violently, but the sound was swallowed by the helicopter. He marched across the grass, his tuxedo shoes slipping on the damp earth, intent on berating the pilot, intent on asserting his authority over this interruption. I could hear him screaming as he got closer, his voice finally cutting through the noise as the rotor slowed. "Who gave you permission to land here? This is a private event! Security!" He ran until he was 20 feet away. Then the spotlight from the helicopter shifted, hitting him square in the chest. He stopped dead. His eyes adjusted to the glare, and he saw the figure standing next to the pilot. He saw the worn gray suit. He saw the scuffed shoes. He saw his father. He looked from me to the sleek $10 million aircraft. He looked at the pilot, who was holding the door open for me with absolute deference. He looked at the logo on the tail of the helicopter, a stylized silver V. I saw the moment the recognition hit him. It was a physical thing, like a punch to the gut. He knew that logo. It was on the letterhead of Veritas Holdings. It was on the branding of the logistics company he worked for as a regional vice president. It was on the sign at the front gate of this very estate. The realization hit him like a physical blow. He staggered back a step, nearly tripping over his own feet. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The arrogance drained out of him, replaced by a sudden terrifying confusion. Vanessa's father, Robert, stepped up beside Julian. He was a man who knew money. He looked at the helicopter, then at the logo, and then at me. His eyes widened. He grabbed Julian's arm, his grip tight. "Julian," Robert said, his voice audible over the winding down engine. "That's the chairman's bird." I walked toward the helicopter, then stopped. I turned to face them one last time. Julian was close enough now that I could see the sweat beading on his forehead. His tuxedo was ruffled by the rotor wash, his bow tie slightly askew. He looked small. He looked like a boy playing dress-up in his father's clothes. I leaned in, pitching my voice to cut through the mechanical whine. I yelled. He screamed, his voice cracking high and thin with panic. "Dad, what is this? Whose chopper is this?" I said, my voice thundering across the gap between us. "Just like this venue is mine." The color drained from his face so fast he looked like a corpse. He looked at Robert, desperate for someone to tell him this was a joke, a prank, a dream.
But Robert was staring at me with a look of dawning horror and respect. "Mr. Robert stammered, "You're Thomas Cromwell?" I ignored him. My eyes were locked on my son. I shouted, pointing at the estate, at the sky, at everything. "I was gonna hand you the keys to the kingdom today. I was gonna retire and give it all to you." Julian took a step forward, his hands reaching out, trembling. "Dad, wait, please. I didn't know." I cut him off, my voice hard as iron. "I smell like poverty." I reached into my pocket and pulled out the wooden compass. I held it up for a second, letting the landing lights catch the worn varnish. It looked like nothing. It looked like junk. But it was the only thing I had left that was real. Julian begged, tears starting to form in his eyes. "I'm sorry," I said. I tossed the compass. It arced through the air end over end and landed in the grass at his feet. He looked down at it, then back up at me, his face crumbling. I turned my back on him. I climbed into the cabin, the smell of rich leather and success enveloping me instantly. It was quiet inside, insulated from the chaos I had left behind. The pilot jumped in and slid the heavy door shut, sealing out the noise, sealing out the begging, sealing out my son. "Go," I said. The engine roared back to life. The helicopter surged upward, the G-force pressing me into the seat. The ground fell away. I looked out the window. I saw the wedding party below, shrinking rapidly. I saw the guests pouring out onto the lawn, pointing up at the sky. And I saw Julian. He was standing alone in the center of the circle of crushed grass, looking up, his arms hanging limp at his sides. Vanessa had stepped away from him, moving toward her father. Julian looked like a child who had just let go of a red balloon and watched it float away forever, knowing he would never, ever get it back. I opened the mini fridge in the console and pulled out a bottle of sparkling water. I cracked the seal, the hiss sounding loud in the cabin. I took a sip. It was cold and clean. I sat back as the estate became a toy house, then a speck, then nothing but a memory. I didn't feel triumph. I didn't feel joy. I felt peace. I had taken out the trash. And for the first time in years, the smell of mothballs was gone.
All I could smell was the clean, cold air of altitude and the limitless possibility of a future where I no longer had to apologize for who I was.